Now, for more on where the world stands now, 2 years after the Paris Climate Accord, I'm joined by Ethan Zindler, head of Americas at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Welcome to the show.
Thanks.
So as we saw, China and the US coming together as the world's biggest emitters to really seal the deal with this Paris Accord. Obviously, a lot has changed since then. Let's start with China's role. How much progress have we seen from them on that front?
So China's made important progress, and we're expecting some news this week about a new carbon market in China that'll be national. They've been piloting these things. So clearly, there's been a great deal of growth for clean energy. We expect that this year China will set a record by far for the most solar installations ever for any country in the world. That said, Chinese emissions are still very, very high, and still new coal capacity coming online, real problems with air quality in a lot of Chinese cities which are yet to be addressed.
Obviously, still a lot of work in progress. Now, if we also look at the role of the US, we saw that the US was pulling out of the Paris Accord when the Trump administration came into power. How do you see that changing China's role, if at all?
Well, I think it opens the door in many cases for a lot of other countries to take leadership. I mean, certainly China has the opportunity now to seize the mantle as the global leader in climate change if it wants to. I think part of what's gone on in Paris this week has been that the French have been trying to take that ground themselves and seize some moral high ground as well. So there's a real opportunity. China already on some of these clean energy technologies is a leading hub when it comes to manufacturing of solar equipment, of wind turbines and other equipment as well, electric buses, 15,000 buses were electrified in Shenzhen just very recently. So there's a lot of progress happening and a real opportunity, but it really has to be seized in many ways.
And as you mentioned, French President Emmanuel Macron really wanting France and especially Europe to take a leadership role. How feasible is that? We know that Germany is still heavily reliant on coal. Where do you see its role going forward?
So it's going to be very interesting. I mean, one of the big questions for Germany really is how they actually deal with nuclear. One of the reasons why they've got so much coal going right now is because they shut down a lot of nuclear plants. So these questions are very much interrelated. I think there's certainly an opportunity there. Like, historically, Europe had been really the intellectual leader around climate issues. Then the Obama administration came along. President Obama showed a great deal of leadership, and now the Chinese are getting involved as well. So frankly, it's good to have virtuous competition in this area, good to have more countries that want to take a leadership role overall. I'm happy to see that competition. It would be nice if the United States would engage in that as well.
Now, we know that even though the Trump administration pulled away, we've seen a lot of voices from the private sector, mayors, state, city officials. Can they do enough to offset the role that would have been played had the U.S. stayed in the accord?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's always worth separating these two things out. The accord is essentially an international promise to do stuff that you make to other countries. What's more important, though, are the domestic policies that you put in place. And a lot of those from the Obama administration essentially still live on. Now, to be clear, Trump is trying to roll back a bunch of these, and a bunch of that is in process. But it's not clear how far he'll get in all of that. So there may end up being continuing follow through. The other thing to note about the U.S. and our power sector here is that we are essentially decarbonizing anyway because we have a great deal of natural gas available, which is lower carbon and cheaper than coal. And we've been doubling basically renewables over the last 8 or 10 years as well. So there's a lot of progress that's being driven by technology and by costs, which is somewhat, I would say, protected from policy.
Now, let's also look at the costs, in fact, when it comes to trying to combat climate change. What role do you think the wealthier countries should play, especially those that really played a disproportionate role in creating a lot of these carbon emissions when it comes to the damage that we see from the weaker countries that really bore the brunt of this?
So I think that's one of the real disappointments, I would say, since Paris 2 years ago and from the Copenhagen Agreement, 6 years earlier, is that basically there was a pledge that wealthier countries were going to essentially make about $100 billion available to less developed countries to deal with climate change. There are a variety of ways to try and count that, but no matter how you slice it, that hasn't happened. We're really nowhere near that $100 billion number. And so I think there does need to be a lot more to facilitate north to south flows. One of the things that our firm does is try and track those dollars. We said there was probably about $10 billion only that went into clean energy last year from north to south, from OECD to non-OECD countries. That's not a lot of capital in the grand scheme of things.
So then what do you think would be the best way then to try and finance some of these climate change efforts since these goals aren't being met?
Well, there are really two sides to it. I mean, I would argue that in a lot of cases, there are financial institutions that do want to put money into emerging markets, not just because they're being virtuous, but because they're growing and there's real opportunities to make money there. The challenge often is that these countries have not put in place adequate policies that essentially provide assurance to investors that they're going to earn a rate of return. So there's really two sides to the coin here. There needs to be generosity and there needs to be availability of capital. On the other hand, a lot of these countries need to do more than simply show up at Paris and sign an agreement. They need to go home and put in place domestically policies that follow through on those commitments.
And just quickly, we have about 30 seconds left. We know that the global consensus on climate change, it was environmental, diplomatic, and economic. What needs to happen so that we're not in the same position in the next 2 years?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think a big part of it has to be that there needs to be systems put in place to make sure that countries domestically do follow through on the promises that they made in some kind of way. That's a tricky thing because, frankly, a lot of countries don't necessarily want to be monitored by other countries.
Right.
They don't necessarily like the idea. So it's easy to essentially show up and make a promise, but it's harder to agree to allow you to come and take a look at me every day and see how I'm doing on everything. So those kinds of systems have to be set up and established going forward.
Indeed. Well, hopefully they heed your words. Thank you very much. Ethan Zindler, Head of Americas at Bloomberg New Energy Finance.